Welcome to the Recover You podcast. I'm Kylene.
And I'm Patrick.
We are a couple in recovery
from sex addiction
and betrayal trauma. Together, we share our story to encourage you on your journey. It's here that we talk about sex addiction, betrayal trauma, mental, emotional, and physical health, faith, and anything and everything needed to recover you to your most authentic self that God created you to be. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Recover You. Patrick and I are very excited today.
Very excited.
Have a friend on the podcast. And today we're going to talk a little bit about mentorship. And so in the context of what we're talking about here, mentorship can show up in a lot of different ways throughout recovery. Two primary ways is leading groups, helping other people through the recovery process, or maybe even a little bit more one-on-one personal connection and support through the process. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how that shows up and why that's important today. So welcome, Dave. We're so happy to have you.
I'm so happy to be here. Looking forward to it.
We would love to hear a little bit about your story, and introduce you to the people that listen to our podcast, because I know that you were literally one of the first people that Patrick met as he got into his own recovery. When we tell this story, I drove him to the Conquer group, and I was in the car waiting for him in the parking lot.
I remember.
Yeah. And I remember it was episode 4. Is that right?
Yeah, episode 4.
Episode 4. And he comes out, and we had just gone through, it was less than a week at that point of drama. And he came out happy, and he was filled with hope, and he was so excited. And I know that a huge reason of that was the content of the program, but it was also meeting you and feeling the support and the encouragement, and feeling safe with you in that group. And that made a huge, huge impact on him. And I remember a lot in those beginning months him just talking about how much he appreciated you and your support. So we're very happy to have you here today.
Thank you for your kind words. And I appreciate your enthusiasm, Pat. I mean, you really dug in deep into this program and into the relationship, and there were only 3 of us in that group.
That's right. Yeah, and I
was happy to get a new guy.
But it was during COVID. I remember we actually wore masks. 2020. Initially, and I remember my perspective of that group was it was you. And you had your own story, which I won't, take the details of, but you were certainly well into your recovery versus mine. And I remember thinking that was such and I remember thinking like, I'm going to get there. I was like, I'm going to get there. And then the other gentleman, from my recollection, I'm not going to use his name, but I don't think he was struggling at all. I think he was just being involved in a group. And so I really felt that at that moment, it was great to have 2 men really come around me, and in that moment of just deep pain and deep brokenness, and I really felt like it was through all of these painful moments, it was a really safe space to step into. And I've used a lot of the things that you did. I think you always show the Mercy Me song. I forget the name of it. You showed a video of it.
Oh, yeah. It's the one where they run it backwards.
Right, they run it backwards.
I forget the name of that song.
Right, yeah, we'll come up with it. But I still show that.
They run the video backwards.
Yeah, and it's about people that thought that their brokenness was their identity, but it's not anymore. And so I always show that video when we have the opportunity in my group. So there's a lot of things that I've been able to take away from you. And so, it's nice to know that there's a partner in the local area that's really a big part of it. So
yeah. And the only way we get started doing this is by, unfortunately, going through our own stuff. So how did you get involved in all of this?
Well, when my church brought Conquer Series in, it was 2015, and I'd struggled with this for 35 years. I should probably say at this point I'm retired. I'm almost 70, and
you look great.
Thank you. I used to be a runner, no more, but I was an accountant throughout most of my career, and grew up on a farm. I like to say I grew up in nowhere, Ohio. It was a little community in southern Ohio, southeastern Ohio, in Appalachia. Good family, 3-generation family, grandpa, grandma, mom and dad, my sister and me. But I was the youngest. Some of the wounds associated with being the youngest sort of I felt wounded, but it was, I look back and my dad did not have any of this stuff. There was none of this stuff in the house. I did, and they sheltered me from it. It wasn't until I was 25 that I actually procured porn for the first time ever. And so I don't know how unusual that story is, but maybe for my generation, it's not that uncommon, because back then you just had to go buy it. And it's a shameful thing to go to a store. I've done it, very few times, and it's just a shameful thing. But so that was good. That kept me from it until I was an adult. Interestingly, I was 25. A few years prior to that, my senior year in college, two of my best friends, one had gotten married and the other was getting married. I had no prospects. And I really never thought about this. I hadn't thought about this for years when I got into the Conquer series, but Conquer series talks about painful experiences and then vows, decisions you make, negative decisions you make, and then the lies you're believing when you do that. And so I could take you to the place on my campus, Bowling Green State University, 1977, the winter, my senior year, just a few months from graduating. And I'm walking to class, feeling good about graduating, but feeling depressed about no prospects for a wife. I always wanted to be. I was one of those guys that wanted to be married. And I was a Christian at the time. And so I can't believe when I tell the story, I think, what an idiot. But I said to the Lord, I reserve the right to be unhappy until you give me a wife. And then I kept moving on, and I forgot about it. And I struggled with being depressed I moved to Dayton, Ohio after that. I got a job, got involved with the church I'm in now. There was a great singles group. My wife was in that group, but we didn't date for a long time, but my future wife, that is. But I felt called to seminary. So 4 years later, I went to seminary. 3 years later, I went to seminary because I felt like my accounting job was just a way station on the way to my real job, which was to be a pastor. And I went to seminary, was pulled away from, and God had a purpose in taking me there. I was pulled away from all my familiar surroundings, the comfort of a steady job with steady income, and in a different city up in Chicago. And I was just depressed out of my gourd. Anyway, that year became a failure academically. First time it was a horrible year academically. But I did get some counseling that year. And the counselor asked me a question that brought that vow back to my mind. I said, well, yeah, I did. I forget what the question was, but I answered her question, and she said, you need to repent of that vow. You don't say things like that to God without some effect. And so I did, and I thought, well, it'll be, and this is sort of typical of me, it would be smooth sailing from here on out. Well, it wasn't. As a matter of fact, as I decided later, a few months later in that year, that this is not for me, I need to go back to Dayton, get a real job, I felt like that's when I first procured porn. When I first bought it when I was at seminary, which is, that's a bummer. That's a real disappointment in yourself. But I felt like God had let me down, although I didn't say so at the time. I felt like it doesn't matter anymore. So I'd lost my dream, felt like I lost my calling. And so that opened the door, and it truly is like a baited hook. It made it easier to and that was a magazine. And then I went to went to a movie that was R-rated. I never did things like that. Came back to Dayton, and I was sort of in two minds. One mind, I was really energized to prove that you could live a Christian life as a business person. And so that I felt like was my new mission. But at the same time, this porn thing had gotten a hook in my soul. And so I would struggle occasionally. I haven't bought too many magazines in that period of time. I didn't get into magazines too much, but when the VCR came out, I'm dating myself. This was in the early 80s. When the VCR came out, business trips. It was just easy to look at bad movies and things like that. And then in the 90s, I got married in 85. I sort of thought it would go away, but it didn't. We were both older, and so we started having kids sooner, and just the stress of work. Career was very stressful for me. And basically, it's easy for me to operate out of fear and performance based on fear. And I was in a fairly high performance area. I was working at NCR after I got my MBA, and did some business trips, looked at some pay-per-views on the business trips. So it got a hook in my soul in those ways. And then a few career choices later, out of town, it deepened. In the 90s, we moved to Eastern Ohio and then to West Virginia. My job was very unsettled. My career was getting unsettled. I failed at one point, for an accountant to fail, basically, I was the CFO of this company, and we got a chief financial officer, and we got a bad audit.
Oh, no.
And I think they would have fired me. But the company was in such bad shape, they probably thought, we'll wait on that because I'm not sure we'll get anybody any good. I'm not sure what was going through their mind, but it was a really difficult time, Charleston, West Virginia. And I was struggling. Probably that was the worst time. The internet was out there for the first time. And so the internet got hooks in me. I was always once we moved back to Dayton, pretty much got my life somewhat under control. Things stabilized career-wise. And we were back amongst people we knew and friends and networks and things like that. But for the first decade of this century, it was more of a binge purge. I didn't even know the words, binge purge. And so I didn't think I was addicted. And I wasn't really sure I was. At different times I'd take that sexual addiction screening test from the Conquer series when I got into that. But I was addicted. It was a big step to come to that point. I did a course in 2009, and it was good while I was in it. I actually led it with some young Air Force guys. And it was thrilling to be in a group where the guys were really serious about this part of their walking with the Lord. But that one didn't really get to the root of the problem, I think. Conquer series got to the root of the problem. So when I stopped being part of that group, I sort of went back to some of the old bad habits. And I think a lot of people probably can relate to this. You get to the point where you think, I was almost to the point, it scared me sometimes. Even though I don't think I went, well, it scared me because I thought, this is going to lead me to be unfaithful in physical terms to my wife, which I never was, but it's pulling me that way. And I don't feel like I can beat it. Should I just make peace with it and just accept it? Yeah. And that scared me.
Yeah.
And then the Conquer series came along, and my wife knew a little bit about, because I told her a little bit, but the Conquer series really put me on a plan where we got to the root of the issue for me. Are we really, do I really understand everything about me now? No. But that was my journey, and it was just, couldn't beat it. But by God's grace, that's sort of my story.
Thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And by the way, one thing I did mean to mention, my wife knew a little bit about it, but part of the program in the Conquer series is you go through the Conquer series 10 weeks, and then you go through 7 pillars, which is like 30 weeks. And the 7th pillar, you're working on a disclosure to your wife. And that was one of the scariest moments of my life. Yeah. But she was so gracious. And it was very healthy to do that for me. Because one of the lies I had learned over the years was you've got to hide the negative things about yourself.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the opposite of the truth. So like one time I was invited I'd been a Christian for a lot of years, high school. That's when I became a Christian. And I was sort of a leader. in various ways. And this is a bummer when you're addicted to this kind of thing and you're a leader. But I got invited from time to time to share my testimony, and I would always share it from the point of view of victory. You know, and you know, before I was a Christian, I was a schmuck. Became a Christian, everything got put back together, and here I am.
Right, magic.
That's not a Christian testimony.
It's not.
Right.
Yeah.
Christian testimony is more like what I'm saying here, and that He loves me still,
Right.
and He's not through with me yet, and that He, you know, one of the exciting verses I learned in this whole process, I remember how, I'm getting chills now thinking about it. There's a verse in 1 Timothy where Paul says, the aim of our ministry, he's telling this young pastor this, the aim of our ministry is the love that comes from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. And it hit me one time because I knew enough about Bible study to know that words mean things. And I latched onto the good conscience and the pure heart. I said, I can have that back. That was super exciting to me. I just shared that with the guys this morning.
Yeah.
It's still super exciting to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Patrick talks about that all the time as he was living in two different worlds, right? The outside was the version he wanted to be, and then he was acting in a way that he didn't want to be that person. So he showed people the version of himself that he wanted to actually be through and through. And through recovery, he gets to live with integrity on both sides. Yeah. And so he has that connection of kind of what you're talking about there with the clean conscience, you know, and that it's transformational, I'm sure, in the mind and just feeling secure in who you are.
Yeah, it's a form of peace.
It is. It is. You know, you said a lot of really great things in there. There's two things that you've said, and I've heard you give your testimony before. And it's always awesome. But the first one is, it's a bummer. It's a real bummer.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I remember just thinking that same thing, like, well, is this all there is? You know what I mean? Like, well, at this point, it wouldn't be part of my life. At this point, it wouldn't be part of my life. Yet you blow right through those gates, and then you start to think, well, it's never gonna change, and it's really depressing, and it's really because you just don't understand why you haven't been able to. And you're a very accomplished person, and so how, you know, as far as, you know, from an earthly standpoint, you know, you've really, you know,
I'm a moderately accomplished.
Yeah, right? But, you know, I mean, you're getting an MBA and being a CFO, and you know, those aren't easy things to do. But then the other thing, you know, you talked about when you took that courageous step and disclosed to your wife, and I've really thought about this a lot recently, and I've talked about it on the podcast. It's amazing that once you just let the walls down and speak into your story, even though you think there's going to be major consequences, the level of healing that comes to you personally, and in many cases relationally, is unexpected. It's almost, you can't really put words to it, you know, and as to what that means. And so you didn't dare believe that it could be that way. Right. You thought in your mind that this is the way it's X equals Y, or X plus behavior equals Y. Actually, it's so much better than what you. So that's always a real encouragement for folks. It's, hey, I know it's hard, it's scary, but you got to trust this process, because I think it yields something. I agree, and I think in biblical pictures, Alexa, is one of the things that Conquer Series encourages us to do, is thinking prophetic promises, scripture promises, but try to give them as pictures. So I picture the prodigal son, which is a very vivid story of him coming through town and filthy because he's been through a lot. And then his dad sees him, which is heartbreaking, kind of in a good way. And his dad starts running toward him. And so, you know, that formula, that equation you just did, the thing that's missing from that equation is I take one step, maybe half a step towards God, and he runs 10 steps or 100 steps toward me. Christ runs towards me and embraces me. And you say, really? Yeah. Is that really the faith I believe? I think it is. I didn't know that before. Yeah. Wow. And I almost had to go through. There's no justification for sinning, obviously, but I think the silver lining in sin is when you come to terms and you realize God still loves you. Yeah.
And then he shows you that some way through the grace of another person, like a wife.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you had mentioned, I think this is sort of what you guys are talking about. You were mentioning fear in the process, and almost coming to this thought that, like, what if I can't overcome it? And I'm sure that plays a lot into like the continuation of the behavior as well, because fear leads to shame, and it's going to trigger. And isn't that exactly what addiction and Satan and the evil in the world would play on, is our personal fears about ourselves and our own limiting beliefs about who we are? I think what you're describing is that healing and perfection in God is like when we're willing to actually be vulnerable, which is one of the greatest fears that we would have, would be that allowing people to see us who we really are. And coming into that community, which is such a huge piece of the healing process. And you had actually mentioned in your story, you moved back to Dayton and things got a little bit better. But you associated that with like being in community and being around people that you knew. And I thought that was an interesting comment that you made, because I think that does play such a role, right? When we feel safe, when we feel seen, when we feel heard, we feel like we can be who we are a little bit.
Yeah, we're designed to be in community.
Yeah,
in a trusting community.
Yeah,
which, by the way, the Conquer series sort of develops groups like that, men's groups and women's groups like that, where because they're not normal. You don't even find them that often in the church sometimes. Well,
there can be
they're good groups, but you can't always talk about anything.
Right. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that actually, because you mentioned a couple times that Conquer helped you get to the root where another program did not. So what do you consider the root to be?
Well, the roots for me were, that's a good question. Fear. Fear was a big one. I remember when I came out of college, I remember that my first year, and I was a CPA, or I was working for a CPA firm. I was working tons of overtime. And all of a sudden I'd gone from college, which I didn't work during college year. I just did my studies. I worked summers, and I had all this free time, but no money. I come to Dayton, get a job thinking, wow, I'm going to be making all this money, but I had zero free time. It felt like I had zero free time. And this may not make sense, but I was afraid, is this the rest of my life? Because I'm not sure I like this. And, I did okay in that job. I was in that job for 3 years before I went to seminary. But I really didn't thrive in it, because it was, and I had a lot of fears of, and I had a fear of confrontation. So one of the lies I would tell myself, I discovered in this Conquer series process, the 10 worst moments, one of the lies is conflict is bad. And embedded in that was the fear of people getting angry at me. I really feared that. I still struggle with that. Now, I think my dad had a temper. He wasn't an alcoholic. There was no alcohol in my house. I really have a high regard for my dad. God rest his soul. He's with the Lord now. But he was, he had a temper. Yeah. So, and I was afraid of it. He spanked me a few times. Those days you got spanked. And, but he, and I remember the first time I felt like he felt proud of me was when I graduated from college, which was good. Things changed after that, but there's a fear associated with the need to please people.
Sure.
So pleasing people so that I could keep from getting yelled at. That sounds really juvenile, but it was there. I didn't like being yelled at.
I think that's a common.
Oh my gosh.
People pleasing. Wow.
I think that's so common.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't imagine going through boot camp, because that's just my impression of boot camp.
It's like your worst fear.
Army boot camp is
you're never good enough and you're getting yelled at. Yeah. Exactly.
And maybe that would have been good for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it does. Yeah. When you go through something like that, you do learn in your moment, whenever moment that is, to learn that you're never going to make it. You're always going to be in trouble. It doesn't matter. So then how do you thrive after that?
So one of the things I learned, I've seen a lot of movies, and I've read The Lord of the Rings, and there's a phrase in there, and I adopted it, and I say it to myself a lot, because I was a man who was bound up in a lot of fears, and I'd medicate the fears with porn and other things. I took a quote out of that movie, out of that book series, The Ring That Rules Them All. There's one ring that rules them all. I said, there's one fear that rules them all. And it really does. It's powerful. The fear of God, people don't like to talk about fearing God, but the fear of God is the one healthy fear. And it subordinates all the other fears. It quiets them down. It puts them under control because I fear God. Mm-hmm. And so I try to tell myself that a lot. It's one of my promises I tell myself. Yeah. It's one of the truths I speak to myself. Yeah. I think coming to the point where I admitted that it was hard for me to admit that I was full of fears. Yeah.
It sounds too like when you came to the Conquer series and connected it to the idea of addiction, that was a difficult realization as well.
Yeah, it was new. I didn't want to think of myself as addicted.
Yeah.
First time I took that SAST, the sexual addiction screening test, I took it in the book, and they've changed it. They had changed it online, and I later took it online. And when I took it in the book, I'm like, yay, I'm not an addict. Yay. And I'm not sure how honest I was being the first time I took it either. But I tried to be honest. I might not have been aware. Honesty and awareness. Anyway, and then the next time I took it, probably a year later, oh, I am an addict. Mm. So, so, I had to come to terms with that. I didn't like that label.
What do you think? You talk about fear being a huge driver, but then even the fear of coming to the awareness that you're just talking about and the vulnerability and learning what you learned. Yeah. What do you think actually was the change for you that shifted? What was the gear shift for you that made the difference?
Well, between, I'm not sure I understand.
Between being, I don't want to do this, but I can't stop doing it. I'm going to do it anyway, or I might struggle with this the rest of my life, and I'm in recovery.
So there was a phrase that I started hearing a lot, that addiction is a intimacy disorder, right? Mm-hmm. Sexual addiction is an intimacy disorder. I couldn't relate to that. I couldn't get my accounting brain around that. But in terms of, but I'm sure I had a lot of intimacy disorders. I just didn't know what they were. I couldn't really describe them and measure them and things like that. But I think where the switch flipped was the roots of my problem were where I was disappointed with God. I felt like God abandoned me, in seminary. That was a big root of it. Some roots went back to childhood. And when I started to act on that, God felt distant, and I felt not in his crew, so to speak. I felt purposeless. And the Conquer series showed me the love of God really did welcome me back. And I think what started to happen, I can't really point to a time. What started to happen was my relationship with God, reading in the Bible. I was reading a lot of Psalms back then for my devotions. And I didn't do my devotions every day, but when I would do them, I would generally be in Psalms. And my namesake, David, expressed a lot of things. And I think I started to enjoy God's company. And to me, that's the biggest motivation. I mean, enjoying being faithful to my wife is probably the second biggest motivation. I'll put those in that order, but the relationship. So I started to understand that there's a joy in walking with the Lord, that if I choose this other path, I'm going to lose that. Mm-hmm. There's a joy in walking with my wife in peace and openness that I'm going to lose. And so I started to come at the understanding of the intimacy disorder that way. So when you choose things like that, when I choose things like that, I was putting walls up. Mm-hmm. I think you said that a few minutes ago, but it was really, that was not an easy thing for me to put in words, even now.
What always, I think, was really helpful for me being in your groups was you didn't talk about the weekly tasks. You actually showed us how you did them. So, for example, when we get to the thing and you talk about the survival kit, I remember you were the one. You're like, "This is my survival kit." And I think you had a box. Yeah. At the time, you had a box, and so you showed us. You actually did that. So you did the deep work that was required, the 10 worst moments, and then the vow that came from that. And I know, and I've seen you over time, you had 10 prophetic promises that came out that you meditated on, and that countered your 10 worst moments. And now you have a sheet, and I don't know how long your sheet is now, but a couple of years ago it was like 4 pages long. I would imagine. But I think that from mentorship is a lot of things, but your approach was very much, hey, this is how I set the example. So for a guy like me, that was all the things you said was, I'm never going to beat this. There's no path out of it. And then you say, I think at the time, I'm 6 years in sobriety or whatever that number was. And look at all the things I've done. And then so in my mind, I could very quickly go, sobriety or recovery equals work. And I was able to just say, okay, I'm going to double down on this work. And you were very effective at demonstrating that on an ongoing basis. And I don't think every leader will do that in Conquer.
So that wasn't a technique, because I'm not really self-aware of those kinds of techniques, but I think I was learning what you're describing. I think I was learning to be transparent. Of course, it's always been rather easy for me to talk about solutions to things because that's safe. But probably what you noted too is the little boy enthusiasm would come out of me when I started.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh yeah.
Even though I'm 69 years old.
Yeah, you get all excited. Yeah.
I remember there was a time. This is an aside, but you can ask God for crazy things, crazy good things. But when I was struggling with depression that year in seminary, came across the story, I think it's in 2 Kings 4, anyway, where God comes to Solomon in a dream and he says, "What do you want from me? And what do you want me to do for you?" And Solomon, of course, answers with the famous, "Give me wisdom to rule your people." And it made me think, what do I want from the Lord? Well, right now I'm depressed. I want enthusiasm. I didn't ask for joy exactly. I wanted enthusiasm. And I know he gave it to me because, and like God sometimes does, he overpours. He fills your cup up in many ways, but I ended up becoming a kid again in so many ways in that enthusiasm. And I really like that. But it tells me that God he really likes it when we ask him for things like that. He was pleased when Solomon asked that. I mean, I think he was pleased when I asked that. And I used to want to be a mentor when I was a young Christian because I really respected guys that did that. I knew the Navigators ministry well. I was in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, but I never had any real skill at programming it out. So it's very encouraging. Thank you for sharing that. But I think transparency is probably a powerful tool in lieu of that. So
I wouldn't even say in lieu. I think vulnerability and transparency is sometimes what makes the best mentors. Because when you are leading, that's one of the best ways to lead by example. So people can see and connect. The connection is so important. If you're going to follow someone or try to imitate them or do what they're asking you to do, I think having that connection, that authenticity is what essentially I think was speaking to Patrick in a lot of ways. It's like he's accomplished what I want to accomplish, and he's being honest and vulnerable and showing me how he's done this. That's somebody that I want to imitate. And so I think that is probably more than maybe you give yourself credit for.
Yeah. One of the things that was said to me by a couple of members of the groups that I run is, and this shocked me when I heard this is the most effective discipleship program I've ever been a part of.
Yeah, right.
And I'm always like, wait a minute, that's not the goal.
Yeah.
We're not in, that wasn't, but I think
we don't have everything together.
Yeah, like we don't have pithy sayings, and we don't have, like all these things, and we're just showing up and being like, I'm a broken man. I did these horrible things. I don't want to do these horrible things anymore. I don't know how I'm going to get through this. You know what I mean? And then we're there for each other. Yeah. And, we're kind of in a way, we're like, caregivers ministering to each other. And so because we understand, and I've often said this too, is like, and you can probably relate to this. You get the guy that comes into the Conquer program and he's like, I've done this, and he's so broken. And I know sometimes you'll look across all the other men who are even maybe 1 or 2 or 3 weeks in front of them. They're all like, yeah, you'll be fine. You know what I mean? Like you see that, and it's really, and I imagine at that moment, that person feels like, oh, wow, these people actually, nobody's judging me, and it's going to be okay, And so, yeah.
I believe it really is a discipleship program. There's a sentinel moment that I like to call out in the videos of the Conquer series, in which, I forget his name, but it's the pastor in Hawaii. And he tells his story about how he had an affair, and he was addicted, and he was found out, and he has to come home and tell his wife. And then she tells her story, and his 3 daughters, and she's on the receiving end of this horrible confession. And but she says something super insightful that I like to call out for the men, especially the men who are married. I said, you notice how she said she just wanted her life fixed. She wanted her old life back. Right. She wanted to be able to stay in Hawaii. She wanted to be able to keep their job and standard of living. But God wanted something so much deeper. Mm-hmm. And it takes a lot of, that's true. That's why this is a discipleship program. God will use wherever you're at, whatever problems we have, and he will start working Christ's character into us at that place. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But when we're ashamed of that place and we don't want to go to that place, we're sort of short-circuiting God's work in us. And I just thought, especially for the wife, she was the victim. For her to come to that realization first is powerful. It is a super powerful story. James and Terry Craft. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was such an insightful point. And so this is Christian disciple. This is becoming like Christ, except that Christ never sinned, but he'll touch us at the point of our failure and draw us to himself. Yeah. There's another aspect of these groups too, and we've danced around it a little bit so far, but I want to call it out because Pat and I both have seen this, and we've talked about it and get excited, and you said it affected you too, and it probably did me too. But when you see the guy come in and he's at the end of his rope and he's not sure this is going to work, first meeting, he's not sure this is going to work, his head's hanging, you can see in some of their eyes hopelessness, but maybe just a grain of hope. Just, at least I came. And then they leave with a spring in their step. Mm-hmm. And you know who I'm thinking of. I told you about, he just had a baby recently, with his wife. But to me, when I think of that story, I think of that young man. And there's a verse towards the end of the Old Testament that I was a farmer. I used to raise steers, 1 steer a year. That was my job. And then we'd butcher the steer and have it for hamburger and steaks. But one year I took, it was a beautiful spring day, and we always kept him inside in the barn, and I'd feed, and I thought, the grass is green, the air is nice, it's sunny, I'm going to let Reddy, called him Reddy, I'm going to let him out in the barnyard, and I let him out in the barnyard, and of course, he got out of the barnyard, and I got a phone call. Mom said, Mr. Perry said, do you guys have a white-faced Hereford? He's in my cornfield. So anyway, and he was in southeastern Ohio. We didn't have too many cowboys. He was a cowboy. He had his horse, and he rustled down Reddy and brought him home to us before Dad got home from work, which was really good for me. But I remember, so I've had this vivid childhood experience. of seeing how happy a calf is when he's let out into the pasture. And that picture is a description in the book of Malachi, chapter 4, I believe, of what we are like as Christians. When we are set free and in the ultimate, the new heavens, the new earth, we will be like, no matter what sorrows we go through, no matter what troubles, we will skip about like calves released from the stall. We're supposed to think in pictures sometimes to really get at the root of our emotions. And that's one of my pictures.
Yeah.
I love that picture.
Yeah.
Skipping about,
Yeah, and you're right. You do see that. You see that, when I give out coins to guys when they've been through, and it's a little bit arbitrary the way I do it, but I generally want to see them doing the work and showing up and seeing that heart change, and they treasure it. They really treasure that coin, which is 10 weeks ago they wouldn't have.
Yeah.
And they would have been like, what is this? They might have even made fun of it, or something like that. And so, yeah, you're right. There's a real sense. Now,
it's not a participation award.
That's right. Yeah, it goes with work. It's doubled with work and healing. Now, you approached me. I remember after my discovery.
Months, really.
Yeah, after my discovery, we had made this big commitment that I wasn't going to do anything for a year as far as leading groups.
Leadership.
Yeah, leadership or anything, because it was just like, hey, let's get fixed. But you approached me, it was that summer, about co-leading a group. And I don't know if you recall, I was like, well, I'm a little concerned about this.
I didn't want any leadership get into his head,
Yeah.
Himself. So I was like, this is so soon. What do we do?
Yeah. So how do you, when you're working with men and you're working, you've done countless numbers of these programs.
I've lost count.
Yeah. How do you find the ways to connect with guys at different levels? So I think you saw in me, I guess, a leadership gift.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of went after that, but you didn't approach everybody, and so how do you discern as you're leading the groups, like what the different men may need?
That's a great question. I hadn't thought about it before. With you, it was so obvious because you were hungry.
Mm-hmm.
And I respond more to, I think that's natural to respond. A leader responds more to people who are hungry and enthusiastic. Mm-hmm. Let's put it that way.
Right.
And I think we like to think of it as not so much leadership as it is facilitating things.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, it's quite humbling to be a leader in the Conquer Series group. I remember when I started telling them men's breakfast that I used to go to on Saturday mornings that I'm going to be leading the Conquer Series. And I would want to tell them because I didn't want to give the wrong impression, because I needed the Conquer Series myself. And and so it was a humbling thing, which is good. But I think men who are working through this, once they get to a certain point, really need to be able to give it back.
Yeah.
To pay it forward, if you will.
Yeah.
And for me, speaking for me, and I imagine this is probably true for most guys, and you can tell me what you think. That's when it really got deeply rooted in me. The tools and and again, emotions come into play in this. Emotions in a good way. It wasn't just content that got deeply rooted in me. I don't tell my wife details, but she'll ask me when I come back from. So how'd it go? And I said, one time I told her, I said, I feel like I'm playing tennis and I'm hitting in my sweet spot. I just feel so right in this place I'm at right now with these men. And my heart goes out to these men because I've been there.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what it's like.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's like you can't do anything but this.
Right. That's a great way to say it. I know that what'll hit me at moments, and it's like when you feel like you've heard all the stories, then you hear another one and it breaks your heart. And then it kind of re-energizes you of why you're there and why you're doing what you're doing and why it's so important for us to provide that landing pad or that off ramp or whatever that is for guys. I mean, it's really, really important because it's just because I'm 3.5 and you're 10 or whatever. I mean, this guy's, it doesn't mean that there's not countless folks getting wounded right now, discovering maybe pornography, having an affair, and then in turn getting discovered by their wife, having legal consequences, job consequences. And so it's just so important to have that and these programs for people, because it's just,
because if they weren't there, if this program wasn't here, so many of us, myself included, would be stuck.
Oh yeah.
And that's not where, I mean, that's just unacceptable.
Right.
It's a horrible place.
Yeah, unfortunately, in this thing, you don't declare total victory. We can have individual victories, but the broader victory has to keep, or that battle has to keep being fought.
You know, you were in the military, Pat. I was never in the military, but I read a lot of military history, so I'm sort of an armchair person. But, you know, it's a lot like, from what I've read of battle, that when you're in the thick of battle, you can't really measure how well things are going. A lot of times things might look like you're losing, and or things might look like you're winning and you're losing, and so there's a sense in which you just have to keep plugging away, doing the right things, even if you don't get feedback right away that things are going well, and when you're dealing with a group of guys or groups of guys leading successive groups of Conquer Series guys. Guys are at different places. Some are falling away. A lot of times I think they just need to go or come back later when they're more ready for it. Yeah. But, you know, it's just, you don't get discouraged because there are so many battles. I think the Battle of Midway, the first waves of American torpedo bombers, they were knocked out 100%. They lost 100%.
Yeah.
And somehow God brought about a great victory for America. I mean, there's lessons like that all through. So things are not always as they appear to be, but things are always as God says they are. It's one of my favorite quotes. And so we go in with hope. I mean, you wouldn't be doing this if you didn't have hope.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't doing, neither of us would, if it wasn't doing good things in our soul. But it's sort of a calling, a gifting to share it with other people. I mean, I'll call you out for leading two groups. I'm only leading one. So, and I'm retired.
Between the two of you, though, over the past, what's it been, 3.5 years? How many groups have been started or come off of the groups that you've created?
Offshoots of 7 pillars and things like that.
Some have ended and you've started new ones. I mean, the number just only in the past 3.5 years that, you know, I've been aware of it, has been so many.
Yeah.
Which is incredible.
Yeah.
When you originally got connected to Conquer, were you invited into an existing group or were you invited to start the group? You started it. So you started kind of
it was all brand new when I got into it. And
so that group was sort of mentoring each other at that point. What has it been like for you? What you kind of just mentioned the idea a little bit that it goes both ways, right? That starting these groups, leading these groups, getting them going and helping these people also fills you up and helps you. Right. How do you think that has played into your health, your recovery, your life?
It's been a major significant impact. I did the Conquer Series in 2015. In 2016, we formed a group of 7 guys and we did the 7 pillars. At the end of 2016, we finished, and there was a little bit of a gap. I saw myself starting to slip. Started going back and we were running Conquer Series, and I think I can't remember exactly when I got involved in helping with the Conquer Series groups. But it wasn't shortly after that. It was shortly after that. And then I remember the real breakthrough for me. I was not a professional by any means, or not even that great, but I loved to road bike with this group in my neighborhood. These were hardcore road bikers. We would ride Tuesdays and Thursday nights for 30, 35, 40 miles.
Wow.
In the good weather of the year. And I was in great shape. I really enjoyed it. I got that what's that high? And runner's high from biking. And I remember we tried to set up the second group, we needed a leader for the second, or for a 7 Pillars group. And I really didn't want to do it because it was going to happen on one of those nights. And, but I decided to do that. That was in 2019. And that group's still going now. And I'm not bragging that I made a sacrifice. But it was a choice, and I couldn't do both. I couldn't do the biking and lead this group too. I co-led the group with somebody else, but it was so much. It's paid so much in dividends in my life. I can't bike like that anymore. I can't keep up with that group if I tried, because anyway. But it was dividends paid.
This wasn't really like this vision for you to, start this movement in this area of Ohio. And Patrick was really, we weren't sure that it was the right time for him to jump into like a quote unquote leadership position, but both of you did, and it's transformed lives. And I know a lot of people going through these groups get a lot out of the groups, but we don't see the same number of people coming in, turn around and start their own group. And that's a little bit of a challenge in terms of pushing for that growth and encouraging people to take the step to do that. So if there's somebody listening who maybe is engaged in a group and they're not sure that they should take that step, but they're considering it, or maybe their mentor has suggested it to them, what kind of encouragement would you give to that person just about the value of doing that? Maybe they're busy, maybe they're worried about trying it for the first time by themselves. What would you say to that person?
I would say it's part of the normal recovery process is to pass it on. So you need to have that. You need to be able to pass it on to people in your life. Now, young fathers, young families, a lot of times passing it on to your sons and daughters would be more than enough. Some guys need to listen. I mean, we all need to listen to God when he's calling us to serve in some way. And I remember about 10 years before I retired, I changed jobs from a rather high-powered job, took a big cut in pay, to what I thought was a low-powered job. CFO from a big company, a CFO of a little company. And my whole purpose was to make myself more available. And it worked out okay. My wife and I were talking about it recently. It was like a 50% cut in pay, but it was not a 50% cut in work. But in any event, I wasn't traveling to another city for work anymore. And it did create, it gave me the opportunity to give the gift of availability. And I think sometimes what I was doing before that was I would schedule myself so tight, and I was so up to my eyeballs that I could not be available. And I would urge men and women who love Jesus to consider that the gift of availability, whether by leading a group, certainly your kids come really high up first, probably in that. And so I was not a young dad at that point. My son we had one son, and he was out by that point. So I had that extra freedom of being empty nesters. But being available is a gift. It's a huge gift. And it's a gift that Jesus gave to us, and he wants us to give to one another. It's the gift of availability. You get a phone call, and I don't always, well, nobody always wants to talk on the phone, but, and I don't always practice what I'm preaching right now, but I'm blessed when I do. God really uses it in my life. And
I will say that you were there. There were a couple of key high stress moments through our early recovery that you were a real active participant and an outlet for me through some mistakes I had made and things like that you were just and you gave me perspective. You actually were able to give me good perspective and help me calm down and things like that. And I think I would agree with you. Like you don't have to be George Patton. You don't have to have these titles and things like that. You just have to be available. And I think that, sometimes people get scared about like, well, how do I lead the group? What would I do? What if I don't quite do this? It's like, well, to your point, or to what we talked about earlier, what if you just showed up having already done your 10 worst moments and you say, well, these are my 10 worst moments.
Right.
Now, all of a sudden you're leading the group.
Yeah.
And, it does, that's because there's a lot of folks that aren't doing that.
Yeah. Back to your question a little bit ago too, about how do you recognize somebody who's emerging as a leader? They start thinking like that. They want to share with other guys in the group. This is what I've been working through. Maybe you'll find it helpful. It's not advice. We're not into giving advice, but it's like sharing what works for him. I'm sure the women do the same thing. And I think it just shows a heart that wants to give.
Yeah.
Because we've given too. We love only comes because we first were loved by God. Our giving only comes from God giving to us. We forgive because he first forgave us. Absolutely. It's a pretty natural economy in the kingdom to do that. But I wouldn't say I think it's a calling for some, and stage of life is a very important part of that.
Sure.
Obviously, family responsibilities are super important. I was so absent. Oh, it grieves me to think about how absent I was emotionally and physically, because I worked a lot of overtime and I was under stress. I put myself under more stress than I needed to be, but I was very absent during my son's teenage years.
Right as you said that, and I've as I've gone through my own healing journey, I'll look back on my times with our son, and I'm like, ugh, can't believe I did that. And so, one of the things that a healing journey does for you is it makes you more available. And as you were saying,
that's true.
And you can learn and
emotionally and physically.
Yeah, emotionally and physically, and there's always a chance to be better. There's always a chance to be more available, and I know you're spending the day with your son after this. So, look at that, Yeah, right. So
my son invited me to play disc golf.
That's great. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. So yeah, it's never too late. It's never too, you can always use that to show up for people. And yeah, I think, the amount of hope you gave me and then in turn us was, I know Kylene's a big fan of you and what you've meant in our life. And so it's I know
having that safety, like I mentioned earlier, like the thing, when he would come back from meeting with you, I could just see the energy and feel the energy that he had learned something, that he felt secure and he had hope for the future. And so passing that along, like what a gift that you give other people by doing that.
And let me be clear, it's not me, it's Christ in our dynamic in that relationship. And I imagine you've felt this, the picture I'm going to give you now, but there are times when God's people are together and we're transparent and we're, especially these groups, where you can tell the Holy Spirit is pleased because there's an electricity in the room. Right. And I think the Holy Spirit is more, I can't say that theologically, but it just feels like the Holy Spirit is more active when you have a group of men, in our case, men, and in your case, women, where we are transparent, we are vulnerable, and we are focused on the Lord and helping one another. There's a psalm that talks about that. I think it's Psalm 136 about how great it is when brothers dwell together in unity. It's a great blessing. God is pleased, and I think God lets us know He's pleased. And there's an electricity in the room. Yeah. I like to describe it that way.
Yeah, I like that. It's like an energetic transfer.
An energy,
right? Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, thank you for making yourself available today to us and to everyone listening. I know that they've gotten a lot out of it. And hopefully just even by listening to this conversation, maybe it's redefined the idea of leadership or mentorship, that you don't have to feel like you are a leader to be a leader. You don't have to feel like you're stepping into this huge role, but it is just more about connection and vulnerability and transparency and sharing what you've learned with other people. And that alone can make such a huge ripple effect in the world over time. One person at a time, one group at a time.
Right.
Anything that you would like to leave people with that maybe are on this journey, any piece of encouragement?
I was thinking of another picture. So when we walked in, to all you out there in radio land, podcast land, Pat showed me this little bird that had fallen out of the nest. And there's a scripture in Isaiah, I think it's 40, I forget exactly where, it talks about those who wait on the Lord, they'll rise up on eagle's wings. And it dawned on me not too long ago that most of the birds I see are flap, 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 flap. You know, like the little sparrows and things, and they're flapping furiously to get around. But that's not what eagles do. Eagles soar. They get under the wind of the Spirit, and they stretch out their wings. And I think you can't force this to happen. You can't force yourself into leadership. And you really shouldn't even be thinking about it that way. Just let the Lord, just say to the Lord, I'm available. Use me how you want to use me, and be available to be a servant in one-on-one situations or two-on-one or one-on-two situations in a small way. And God will make you like that eagle, I think. And I mean, he'll lift you up they do not flap that much. They flap a little to get up there.
I love that analogy. I never really thought about it.
Yeah, it's really good.
It's like the harder we work sometimes, the less we do.
Yes.
But the more you can trust or be vulnerable or whatever word you like to use there, the further you think.
Which is back to that intimacy disorder or intimacy thing with the Lord. When we're walking with the Lord, and I know what it's like to walk with Him, and have the wind under my wings, and I know what it's like to flap, 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 flap. And I'm more aware of that than I ever used to be. And sin makes me flap furiously. But when I'm walking with the Lord, I'm clean before Him, walking in a state of transparency with Him and others. His Holy Spirit lifts you up. It's great.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for being here and
That's my pleasure.
For sharing your story and for doing everything that you've done the past few years. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Woohoo! If you're listening to this, it means you've made it through an entire episode. Part of recovery is spending time engaging in healing and self-growth activities. We are thankful that you chose our podcast to be one of those activities today. Make sure you reward yourself for that accomplishment. If you've enjoyed this episode or this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please take just a few moments to leave a rating and review, letting us know your experience with Recover You. We not only love hearing how these episodes are helpful, but ratings and reviews help others just like you who are searching for recovery information and support find the podcast too. We can't wait to hear from you. See you next week.